The afternoon light over the small French village of St. Malo was cold, gray, and thick with the heavy stench of wet ash and fresh iron. It was November 1944. The roar of artillery was just a distant, hollow rumble to the east, but in this quiet cobblestone square, the atmosphere was stretched as tight as a piano wire. General George S. Patton stepped out of the back of his mud-splattered command car, adjusting his thick wool coat against the biting wind. He had driven up to inspect a forward supply hub, expecting to find quartermasters counting crates of rations and fuel drums. Instead, he walked straight into a quiet nightmare. Standing against the cracked, smoke-stained wall of an old stone bakery were three boys. They couldn't have been older than 16 or 17. Their oversized German uniforms hung off their gaunt, trembling shoulders like rags on scarecrows. None of them wore helmets. One of them didn't even have shoes, his feet wrapped in filthy, blood-soaked burlap sacks. Facing them was a line of 6 French partisan fighters, members of the local resistance, their faces hardened into stone by years of brutal occupation. They held captured K-98 rifles, their fingers resting taut against the triggers. There were no judges, no trial, and no audience, just a quiet, rushed execution about to happen in an alley behind a ruined bakery. Patton didn't yell. He didn't raise his riding crop or draw his famous ivory-handled revolver. He simply walked forward, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow across the frozen mud. His polished boots clicked against the stones, each step echoing like a slow metronome in the dead silence. The French commander, a man with a ragged beard and a faded red armband, turned around with an aggressive twitch, his hand flying to his holster. But when his eyes met Patton's icy, steel-blue glare, his arm froze mid-air. The general stopped just 5 feet from the firing squad. He looked at the French fighters, then slowly turned his eyes to the 3 young boys standing against the wall. The boys were weeping silently, their chests heaving, their pale faces smeared with dirt and grime. The middle boy, who looked barely 15, was clutching a small, tarnished silver pocket watch so tightly his knuckles were white. Patton looked down at the mud near the boy's feet. Laying in the freezing slush were 3 empty German belt buckles and a pile of discarded, useless ammunition. These boys had already been disarmed. Under the rules of engagement and basic human decency, disarmed prisoners of war were to be processed, not slaughtered in an alleyway. Patton's voice cut through the damp air like a razor blade, quiet, cold, and razor-sharp. He asked the partisan commander a simple question through his translator. Who gave the order to pull those triggers? The French commander stepped forward, his eyes flashing with a mix of fury and stubborn defiance. He spoke rapidly, his voice raspy from smoke and hatred. He told Patton that these were not soldiers, they were monsters. He claimed that just 2 nights ago, a retreating German unit had dragged his younger brother out of his bed and executed him in the center of town. He insisted these 3 teenagers belonged to the same division, that they wore the same uniform, and that their blood was the only currency left to pay for his brother's life. He raised his rifle, aiming it back at the middle boy's chest, declaring that American mercy had no place on French soil after 4 years of hell. Patton didn't blink. He didn't debate the ethics of war or preach about international law. Instead, he reached out, placed his hand on the barrel of the French commander's rifle, and slowly pushed it down toward the frozen dirt. He looked the commander dead in the eye and told him that if he wanted to kill soldiers, he could join the front lines 10 miles east where the real German army was waiting. But if he fired a single round at unarmed children under Patton's area of command, he wouldn't be remembered as a French hero. He would be hanged as a murderer before the sun set. The tension in the alley was suffocating. The other French partisans shifted uncomfortably, looking between their enraged commander and the formidable American general who commanded an entire army. The partisan leader glared at Patton, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles jumped under his skin. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Finally, the commander spat into the mud at Patton's feet, lowered his weapon, and muttered a dark curse before turning his back and walking away. The rest of the firing squad slowly lowered their rifles and followed him into the shadows of the ruined street, leaving the three terrified German boys collapsing against the cold bakery wall in sheer disbelief. Patton stood there for a moment, watching the partisans disappear. He turned to his young aide, Lieutenant Arthur Miller, and ordered him to gather the boys, get them into the back of a truck, and bring them directly to his tactical headquarters. Miller was stunned. Patton was legendary for his ruthless, uncompromising aggression toward the enemy. He was the commander who pushed his men relentlessly, who demanded absolute victory at any cost. Bringing captured enemy teenagers back to his personal headquarters was completely out of character. But Patton didn't offer an explanation. He simply turned around, stepped back into his staff car, and slammed the door shut. When they arrived at the headquarters, a requisitioned French manor on the outskirts of town, the three boys were led into a small, heated room near the kitchen. They huddled together in a corner, shivering violently from both the hypothermia and the sheer terror of what might happen next. They believed they had only traded a quick French bullet for a slower, colder American fate. Patton walked into the room a few minutes later, stripping off his leather gloves. He didn't bring an interrogator. He didn't bring guards. He walked in holding 3 warm wool blankets and a wooden tray, carrying 3 tin plates of hot stew and fresh bread. He threw the blankets over the boys' trembling shoulders. The youngest boy, the one with the silver watch, stared at the warm plate of food as if it were a hallucination. Patton sat down on a wooden crate across from them, lit a cigar, and leaned back. He spoke softly, his translator standing quietly by the door. He asked them their names and where they were from. The eldest boy, trembling, stammered that his name was Eric, and the middle boy holding the watch was his younger brother, Karl. The third was their childhood neighbor, Hans. They were all from a small farming village in Bavaria. They had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the German Home Guard, just 3 weeks earlier, given 2 days of training, handed rifles with 6 bullets each, and dumped into the path of the advancing Allied war machine. As Karl reached for his bread, the silver pocket watch slipped from his numb fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clink. Patton leaned forward, picked up the watch, and held it up to the light. The front cover was cracked, and the silver was scratched, but carved into the back were 3 German words, God MITDR, God be with you. Patton opened the watch. Inside, tucked neatly behind the glass, was a tiny, faded black and white photograph of a young woman holding a small child. But it wasn't the picture of Karl's mother or sweetheart. Patton's eyes widened slightly as he stared at the photograph, his hand freezing in mid-air. The face in the tiny photograph was unmistakably American. Patton stared at the photograph for a long moment, the cigar smoke drifting lazily around his furrowed brow. The features were striking: a sharp jawline, light eyes, and a small dimple on the left cheek. It was a face Patton had seen before, years ago, framed on a mantelpiece in Virginia. He looked up at Karl, his voice dropping an octave, stripped of all military authority. He asked the boy where he got the watch. Karl sobbed, explaining through the translator that his father had given it to him before he was taken away to a labor camp 2 years ago. Karl's father had been a German clockmaker, but his mother, the woman in the picture, had been an exchange student from Richmond who married his father in 1925 and died of illness just before the war began. Patton sat in absolute silence, staring at the small, worn timepiece resting in his palm. Lieutenant Miller watched his general carefully, completely baffled by the profound shift in Patton's demeanor. The legendary, iron-willed military icon looked suddenly older, carried by a heavy weight that had nothing to do with tactics or supply lines. Patton closed the watch with a soft click, handed it back to Karl, and quietly instructed Miller to make sure the boys were fed, given dry clothes, and placed under strict American military police guard, not as enemy combatants, but as protected refugees. Later that evening, inside his private study, Patton called Miller into the room. A single lantern flickered on the desk, illuminating maps, casualty reports, and an old leather-bound journal. Patton didn't look up from his desk as Miller entered. He told Miller a story he had never shared with his staff. Decades earlier, before the First World War, Patton had formed a deep, lifelong friendship with a brilliant young officer named Thomas. Thomas had a younger sister who was an artist, a vibrant, gentle woman who spent 3 years studying in Europe before settling in Germany. When the tide of political hatred swept over Europe in the late 1930s, contact was lost. That woman was the mother of the frightened teenage boy sitting in the next room, wearing a German uniform. The realization hung in the air like heavy smoke. The war wasn't just a massive, abstract chess game played with divisions and artillery grids. It was a devastating meat grinder that fed on the innocent, entangling families across oceans and borders. Patton looked up at Miller, his face carved out of shadow. He realized that if he had arrived at that bakery square just 3 minutes later, those French partisans would have put a bullet through the chest of his old friend's nephew. A boy forced into a uniform he didn't understand, fighting for a regime he had no part in building. The next morning, however, the fragile peace at the headquarters shattered. The local French resistance commander, accompanied by a French liaison officer, arrived at the manor with an official demand. Word had spread through the village that the American general was holding 3 German prisoners in comfortable quarters, feeding them American rations instead of shipping them to a POW camp. The French liaison officer handed Patton a document, insisting that under local jurisdiction agreements, combatants captured behind the lines without proper military identification were subject to local authority. They demanded the boys be turned over to the French militia for further questioning regarding local war crimes. Lieutenant Miller felt a knot form in his stomach. The legal language was tricky, and refusing the request could spark a dangerous political incident between the American forces and the local French authorities at a critical moment in the campaign. The French liaison officer spoke with cold efficiency, asserting that Patton could not risk his reputation or alliance over 3 enemy combatants. He reminded Patton that thousands of young men were dying every day, and that mercy to the enemy was an insult to the fallen. Patton slowly stood up from behind his desk. He picked up the document, read it once, and then calmly tore it into 4 pieces, letting the scraps fall onto the rug. He walked up to the French officer, leaning in close until they were nearly nose to nose. He told the officer that his men didn't bleed across the beaches of Normandy so that mob justice could rule the towns they liberated. He stated clearly that as long as those boys were under his roof, they were under the protection of the 3rd United States Army. If anyone attempted to take them by force, it would be treated as an act of hostility against the United States military. The French officers left in a fury, promising to escalate the matter to high command. But Patton didn't care about bureaucratic threats. His immediate concern was keeping the boys alive until they could be safely transported to a secure, permanent POW facility in the rear, far away from the bloodthirsty chaos of the frontline zones. He assigned Miller to personally oversee their transport the following morning at dawn. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, bringing a dark, freezing rain over the manor, the true danger of the night began to take shape. Around midnight, a heavy fog rolled off the river, wrapping the manor in a thick, blinding veil. The power line to the headquarters went dead, snapped, or cut. The guards posted around the perimeter reported strange movements near the tree-line. Miller rushed to Patton's quarters, his hand on his sidearm. He suspected the partisans were planning to raid the holding area under the cover of fog and darkness to execute the boys themselves before they could be moved at dawn. Patton immediately ordered the perimeter on high alert, refusing to let his headquarters turn into a battleground. Patton walked down to the cellar where the boys were sleeping. Carl was awake, sitting in the corner with his knees pulled up to his chest, clutching his mother's watch. When he saw Patton enter, he stood up, his voice trembling. Through the translator, Carl whispered that he knew what was happening outside. He knew people wanted them dead, and he didn't want any American soldiers to bleed protecting 3 German boys who were already condemned by the world. Carl reached out, holding the silver watch out toward Patton. He begged the general to take the watch and send it to his family in Virginia if he didn't survive the night. Patton looked down at the boy's outstretched hand. He saw no enemy, no soldier, no ideology, just a frightened child carrying the weight of a shattered world. Patton gently pushed the boy's hand back, closing Carl's fingers over the watch. He told them that a man never gives away his family's memory, and that he would personally ensure Carl delivered it himself. Patton turned to Miller and issued a surprise command. They weren't going to wait for dawn. They were going to evacuate the boys immediately through an old, forgotten drainage tunnel that ran beneath the manor to a secondary road a mile away. While Miller led the three boys through the dark, damp tunnel beneath the estate, Patton remained in the main courtyard of the manor, standing tall in the headlights of his Jeep with two heavily armed military policemen by his side. Within 10 minutes, a group of armed men emerged from the mist at the edge of the property, led by the same vengeance-driven partisan commander from the bakery square. The man demanded access to the basement, claiming they had a right to justice. Patton stood motionless in the pouring rain, his hands resting on his belt. He pointed toward the open gates of the manor and told the commander that the basement was empty and that the war had moved on. He told the commander that holding on to hatred after the fight was over didn't make a man strong. It made him a prisoner to his own bitterness. He said that real victory meant rebuilding humanity, not destroying what little of it was left in the mud. The partisan commander stared at Patton, his breath misting in the freezing air, realizing he had been completely outmaneuvered. With a bitter shake of his head, he ordered his men to melt back into the foggy woods. 2 hours later, a mile down the road, Miller successfully loaded Carl, Eric, and Hans into a covered transport truck bound for a secure processing camp in Belgium. Before the truck pulled away, Carl leaned out of the back canvas cover, looking at Patton, who had driven up in his staff car to watch the departure. The young German boy didn't speak English, but he placed his hand over his heart, held up the silver watch, and bowed his head in profound, silent gratitude. Patton gave a crisp, formal salute as the truck's red taillights faded into the foggy darkness. Decades after the war ended, long after the thunder of the Third Army had faded into history books, a package arrived at a quiet museum in Richmond, Virginia. Inside was an old, scratched silver pocket watch with a cracked glass face, and the words "Got MITDIR" carved in the back. Accompanying it was a letter from an elderly man named Carl, who had lived a long, peaceful life as a watchmaker in Western Germany. In the letter, he detailed the cold November afternoon in 1944 when an American general with a terrifying reputation chose to see a human life instead of an enemy uniform. In the brutal calculus of war, victory is often measured by the land gained, the armies broken, and the power displayed. But true greatness is revealed in the quiet, hidden moments when power is tempered by mercy. General Patton was a warrior built for the battlefield, but his legacy was defined just as much by the lives he saved from the darkness as the battles he won. War tests a soldier's strength, but mercy reveals his soul.